week or whenever it was, and the mugshot comes out. The mugshot in and of itself it kind of has a life of its own. And watching people cover this mugshot story, there's one thing that I see bubbling up to the surface. And that is the relationship of Donald Trump's experiences being indicted 4 times, culminating in this mugshot out of Fulton County, Georgia, and how there is somehow a connection to the black community in the United States. I've seen black influencers saying that Donald Trump, he black now. That's like a quote from multiple of them. And I'm looking at this going, from my position, it's a little perilous to suggest that somehow because Donald Trump has a mugshot now that the black community would now feel closer to him. But it is definitely a conversation that is being had across the board. So I want to bring my friend Adrian Norman onto the show. He's been a guest on the Annie Frey Show for years, and he is back with us. He's a staff writer at Timcast, author, columnist, commentator on Twitter at Adrian Norman DC. Adrian, thank you for being on the show with us today to talk about this issue.
What's going on, Andy? Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.
You bet. So I'm just going to, I've set the table for you, and I'm going to tell you I'm a white woman. I'm a white suburban woman. And a lot of people have a lot of assumptions about what I do and think. You're a black man yourself. You're very in tune with the political space. I'm not going to say anything more about it. I want to give you the opportunity to set the table back for us. Mugshot, Trump, what's going on here?
I mean, you laid out a pretty good picture of what's going on, and I think most people understand it. We're on social media every day. We see what's happening. It's a little upsetting for many people to have the connection made between a criminal offense being related to the black community and Trump specifically being charged and imprisoned as the reason that he might have forged some type of new connection with the black community. And I think it's not necessarily about the mugshot, and that's how it's being interpreted by many. But there are underlying reasons. It's the underlying reasons for the mugshot, which is that corrupt elements within our FBI and criminal justice system have been weaponized against black people. Now they've been weaponized against President Trump and also Republicans, conservatives, who are some of the January 6th defendants. The system has been in place, and now, after decades of sounding the alarm about it, there are many people on the right side of the political aisle who are finally starting to see the light. And I think that's where the overlap is. It's a recognition that there are policies in place that have disproportionate impact on certain groups of people, not necessarily always segmented by race, as we're clearly seeing right now, because Donald Trump clearly is not black. But there are corrupt elements within our government that impact all Americans, right? That's where the overlap is. So we have half of the country that's now finally getting around to see the corruption within our law enforcement establishment. And that's where the connection is, not just the fact that the guy went to jail. I mean, the vast majority of black people aren't criminals. The vast majority of black people haven't been to jail and aren't going to go to jail, just like the vast majority of black people or black kids aren't fatherless. I mean, we have these certain narratives that we push on the right that simply aren't true, right? Yeah. So I think it's a wake-up call for a lot of people. And I think it's something that, if messaged correctly, can be something that sways a lot more people over to at least have a conversation that we may not have had a year ago about where we align politically and how we can move ahead to maybe sort of roll back some of this corruption that we're seeing in our federal agencies and make the country better by being a little bit more united than we've been in the past. Yeah,
it's so well said. We're speaking with Adrian Norman, who is a staff writer at Timcast, author, columnist, commentator. And, it's one of the reasons why I reached out to you to see if you'd have some time for us to talk about this, because two things in my mind are true at the same time. There is absolutely a way to not have this conversation, because I'm seeing it happen from political influencers on both sides of the aisle. So while there is definitely a wrong way to have this conversation, I do think it's very important to still have the conversation, but to do so in a meaningful way, which is to look at the experience that Donald Trump is having at the hands of a justice system that is being used against him for somebody else's political gain, not for the betterment of the American people, the voters who may or may not choose to vote for him next November. But Donald Trump is being treated a particular way because of who Donald Trump is, not because of what Donald Trump has done. And I'm curious where that resonates with any community that exists in the United States. How do you feel, like, what is the responsible way for people who are in my position or for people who hear this conversation being taken place? How do you further the conversation in a responsible way that actually moves the ball down the field?
Well, as I stated previously, I mean, it's to focus on what the actual shared experience is, which is that Donald Trump and again to a greater extent, many of the people who have been prosecuted for January 6th are experiencing the impact of a corrupt criminal justice system. It's the same corrupt criminal justice system that has burdened and plagued Black communities throughout the United States for decades. We've seen the FBI weaponized in the past. It was weaponized against Marcus Garvey. We had Quantel Pro with Dr. King in 2008. George Bush's attorney general, I believe, changed policy allowing FBI agents to segment U.S. cities by race and start targeting ethnic areas based on U.S. Census data. So this is something that is it's not just from the 1950s, 60s, 70s. It's things that have happened fairly recently. And again, we shouldn't have a federal government that is weaponized for political purposes against anybody. And that, to me, seems like the best place to start the conversation, because, again, that's not something that has to be mired in deep racial politics, even though that's part of it. The real issue is the corruption that is plaguing law enforcement at the federal level, at the state level, and the local level. And those are things upon which most Americans are willing to have a conversation. And that's a conversation that should be had.
Yeah, I think back to some of the policy positions and efforts that President Trump made when he was in the White House. And he did look into some of these areas and work with people who were not who you would really expect to be working with the president of the United States for some sort of reform. And the Democrats, generally speaking, have the minority vote in this country. I think a lot of people believe that many of the Latino people who are coming across the southern border are being let in because they will all vote Democrat. I don't actually necessarily know if that's true, especially considering the circumstances that many of them are having to live in once they get to the United States, be taken advantage of in a lot of different ways. There is one party in America that looks at you and has made the decision as to who you are, and if you aren't that way, who you will be, and you will comply. And then there's the Republican Party that is kind of taken over the classical liberal way of thinking, especially politically, which is keep the government where the government belongs and stay out of my business. There's a lot more room for freedom and liberty on the right side of the aisle. How do we get into any sort of community, even the suburban white moms that people keep talking about that need to see the light? How do we communicate that amongst ourselves, not waiting for some talking head to show up and do it? How do we get that message across?
Well, I mean, I think we got to be honest here. I mean, let's just keep it a buck. I mean, there's elements within the Republican Party that don't want Black people in the party either. I mean, yeah, Democrats have had a lock on the Black vote, but it's because Republicans, conservatives do zero outreach in Black areas by and large, right? We talk about this on Twitter quite a bit. There's no investment made in these communities. Every Monday we get online and we talk about Chicago and all the people killed in Chicago and the violence in Chicago and Baltimore and St. Louis and all these areas throughout the country. But there's no real effort that's put forward, no real plan, no real investment to change any of these communities. And even when it comes to doing real outreach, no outreach is done by the party to try to recruit minority people into the party. It almost sort of happens by default. Now, Donald Trump showed that with real attention paid to these issues and the right kind of messaging, that is possible. Republicans generally get 6 to 8% of the Black vote in any national election, right? Donald Trump in 2020 got 15 to 16% of the overall Black vote. There was internal polling that showed that he got like 26% of Black males. I saw numbers just today that showed that in the Midwest, he actually got 30%. Wow. Those numbers they're insane for a Republican candidate. And it's because what did he do differently? He actually spoke to Black people like we have agency. He acknowledged historical truths that most other people just acknowledge and the Republican Party typically runs from. And he had the conversation as if we had agency and as if we were worth having a political discussion with. It wasn't pandering. He did real outreach, and his message was focused on capitalism. It was focused on economics. It was focused on conservative principles that we say we espouse every single day. So if we would just do what we say we believe in, right, and have the conversations that about all the things that we love to talk about and we love to tweet about, have it in front of a different audience and not assume that the people in that audience are intellectually inferior, that they've been voting against you because they're slaves on some plantation. If we have a real conversation, guess what? A lot of those people that aren't voting for you are able to be won over, and Donald Trump showed it as possible. So that is one key legacy item that I think if people within the Republican Party and conservatism implement real change can take place, but we got to step up and show that that's something that's a real priority for people on the right.
Yeah, Adrian, so much of it is just showing up. I mean, literally, what would the Republican Party have to lose to show up in these places? We're sitting in here in St. Louis, as you mentioned, and it's a Democrat hellhole. I mean, I've been carjacked in this town. I've had a gun pointed at me in standstill traffic on a bridge, didn't have anywhere to go. Everybody who I know who works downtown has some sort of story of a close call or something much worse. And there is, at this point in time, no hope for change in this city. Why aren't the Republicans showing up to make an effort is a great question. And what I hear you saying, Adrian, is that Donald Trump made an effort and he benefited from it.
Yeah, absolutely. And well, part of the reason it's expensive, right? In order for real change in some of these areas, it's going to take a long-term investment. This isn't something that you're going to see change in one election cycle, right? We're talking millions of dollars in investments, but over the course of 2 election cycles, we're looking at a period of 8 to 10 years. People have said that sort of change is possible. If they had implemented these sorts of policy changes from a party standpoint 10 years ago, even in 2015 when Trump ran, by right now, we'd be able to move larger swaths of people in these liberal areas toward conservatism, but they never made the investment at all. Yet, we have areas like Chicago where we say, oh, they got what they voted for. Well, first off, when it comes to the illegal immigrant issue, the people are being bussed there from the border by Republican governors. I don't recall anybody in Chicago voting for Greg Abbott. Nobody in Chicago voted for Ron DeSantis. Nobody in Chicago voted for Arizona Governor Doug Ducey. So the idea that they voted for this is patently absurd on its face. Now, you can make the argument that, yes, they voted for people who are advocates of sanctuary cities. Fine, whatever. But the fact of the matter is, if we look at Chicago's special election from this past spring, there were 0 Republican candidates on the ballot. Right. People can say, well, there was no party affiliation. Come on. We know everybody's background. You can get on Wikipedia, you can get on Ballotpedia and find out exactly who these people are. All of them were Democrats. The only option these people had were left or further left. The GOP, and I'm not blaming the party because the party's just made up of people and you can't force people to run, but you can create the circumstances and the conditions that make it easier for people to run, right? Yeah. There was not a Republican option on the ballot. So how do you blame these people for not voting for you when you're not even willing to show up? You're going to lose 100% of the fights that you don't show up to.
Yeah. And really, truly showing up starts from the bottom up. You got to be there. You got to be on the ground. You got to be willing to help real people before you ask them to give you your full support. And the Republican Party absolutely needs to show up in a much, much bigger. It's an investment worth making for all of our sakes. Adrian, thank you for being here with us. Thank you. I appreciate your time and joining us on the YouTube live stream as well. It's great to have you.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
All right. We'll do it again soon. Bye-bye. Adrian Norman, he is a staff writer at Timcast, author, columnist, commentator, and you can find him on Twitter at Adrian Norman DC. A real pleasure to have him on. He's such a smart guy, great perspective, and an honest take. All right, let's take a quick break.